So we're going to get started tonight. Hello, everyone. My name is Abby Courier, and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight, and I look forward to learning more this evening about the Federal Medical Center. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County and southeastern Minnesota. We're so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Loren Else on the Federal Medical Center here in Rochester. After his presentation, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, for those of you that are on Zoom, feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we can get started, I do want to go over a couple of logistical things for our virtual viewers. For tonight, we are going to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. We may also put some links in the chat throughout the night, so be sure to keep an eye on it. Anything that we put into the chat, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a brief survey about tonight's program. It will take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter view, but if you want to see everyone participating, you can do that by clicking on presentation view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to change the view. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. And we're so excited about tonight's talk and hope that you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from Mayo wood to Civil War photography to barn architecture and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Loren Else, who worked for the U.S. Department of Justice for 27 years, including 3 different federal prisons. The last 15 years of his career were spent at the Federal Medical Center as the Environmental Health and Safety Manager. After he retired from the Bureau, Loren worked as a correctional consultant before retiring from corrections. Loren Else has been working as a freelance writer and weekly columnist for the Rochester Post Bulletin for the past 10 years. Loren?
Thank you, Abby. I appreciate it. Whoa. Thank you very much. Good to be here tonight. Hi to everyone on Zoom. Mike, Chris, Steve, and Linda. Hi. So, like Abby said, currently I'm a freelance writer for the Post Bulletin. I compile a day in history for the Post Bulletin and also write a weekly column called Boomer Grandpa, and that comes out every Tuesday, so remember that. The first image you see up here is a friend of mine took this snapshot. It's called The Physical Tools of the Trade. Radio, flashlight, some keys, some cuffs. I just thought it's kind of an interesting shot with the Bureau of Prisons emblem and American flag. So Tony Calabrese shot that, and it's my screensaver. Like Abby said, I worked at 3 federal prisons. I started at the Federal Correctional Institution in Sandstone, Minnesota. How many know where Sandstone is? Anybody? Couple is about 50 miles south of Duluth. If you go straight north on I-35, if you stop at Toby's and have Seminole, it's the next town north. So then from there, I transferred to the United States Penitentiary at McNeil Island, Washington, and it actually was an island. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then I transferred back to Sandstone, and I transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Rochester, Minnesota in 1988. A little bit about the federal prison system as a whole, and I will talk about that, and then I'll get into the Federal Medical Center a little bit more specific. I'll also talk about what I did in my career, and then we'll look at the closure of the state hospital and even go into a little bit of the history of the Rochester State Hospital, which existed for over 100 years in this community. So the federal prison system itself has 122 federal prisons. Currently have 152,000 inmates in their custody, over 37,000 staff, and 46.4% of the inmates are doing time for drug-related offenses. So that's by far what these guys are sentenced for. When I started for the Bureau in 1976, I think we had 25,000 inmates in about 50 prisons. So unfortunately, it's a growth industry. If you didn't know, there's actually 4 federal prisons in the state of Minnesota. The first one, the Federal Correctional Institution in Sandstone that I mentioned, opened in 1939. That is considered a low security, and I'll talk a little bit about the security levels. Currently, it has 915 inmates. The federal prison camp at Duluth opened in 1983. It is a minimum security facility, which means it has no fences. So if a guy wants to walk to the Miller Hill Mall, he can, but he might get in trouble. And they have 298 inmates right now. Then the Federal Medical Center in Rochester opened in 1984. And that's classified as an administrative facility, and we'll talk a little bit about what those custody security levels mean. And right now, FMC has around 615 inmates. And the final federal prison in Minnesota is the Federal Correctional Institution in Waseca. It opened in 1995. It is a low security similar to Sandstone, and it currently has 732 women. The facility opened as a male prison, but it was converted to female in 2008. So here's the 5 security levels in the federal prison system. First is minimum, and usually that means if someone has no violence, they're not doing much time, less than 10 years. And then you go to low, some violence in the record, probably doing a sentence of less than 20 years. Medium, they do have violence, probably doing less than 30 years. And high, of course, is a very high security individuals doing a lot of time for some serious stuff from gang-related stuff as well. And then administrative, and that's what Rochester is. And what that means is that the facility must be able to handle any type of security level inmate that they would receive. So if a guy's at Leavenworth doing triple life and he comes to Rochester for medical surgical treatment or mental health evaluation, we need to be able to handle his security level, as well as a guy doing 10 months at Duluth. So that's the security levels in the prison system. Oh, that's the wrong slide. I was going to show you a normal slide of an inmate room at the Federal Medical Center, but that's the wrong one. But I recognize it. Actually, it's a cell of a famous gangster. Anybody want to throw out any guesses? None? It's Al Capone's cell. So that's actually Al Capone's cell. And that would be, who remembers where Al Capone did time?
Eastern State.
Where?
Eastern State Penitentiary.
I don't know if he was at Eastern State or not, but he was at Leavenworth or Alcatraz in the federal system. He might have done that in the state system. So there's another shot of Alcatraz just for the fun of it. Needless to say, years ago, most of your correctional institutions had a number of towers. They were staffed 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The individuals in those towers had weapons, they had gas, you name it. So that's a tower at Alcatraz. And there's an Alcatraz cell block. Just threw that in for the fun of it. Alcatraz closed in 1963, and believe it or not, it is now a national park. So you can go visit Alcatraz and buy a t-shirt that says, I did time at Alcatraz, if you want. So tough place to work. Some of you may wonder, now why would someone get into corrections? Sounds like a tough business. For me, that's my father, that's my dad. He's a World War II veteran. After the war, he bounced around a little bit, eventually got hired at the penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. He worked in Leavenworth, and then he transferred to the Federal Territorial Jail in Anchorage, Alaska. We lived up there before it became a state. It became a state in 1959, and our family moved up there in 1957 when my dad transferred up there. Then he worked at the federal prison camp at Maxwell, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, and then he finished his career in Sandstone, Minnesota, which is kind of where I grew up and went to high school and stuff. But when I was in college, I was going to teach and coach. At that time in the 70s, there was a lot of information about a lot of teachers were losing their jobs. A lot of teachers couldn't get hired, kind of a glut of teachers, and it just kind of made me a little nervous. I looked over at what my dad did in corrections, and I thought, you know, that looks interesting. And so I did go into corrections, and it was a very interesting and challenging career, and I'd do it again. So that's kind of the reason I went into corrections. When I started at Sandstone, I started as a correctional officer. I did 2.5 years, and then I transferred out to McNeil Island, Washington. McNeil Island is in the southern Puget Sound. It's similar to Alcatraz. It's an island prison, but it was much, much bigger. McNeil Island was 4,400 acres. It had 2 prisons on it. It had a large penitentiary that had 2,000 inmates. And then it had a camp that had 500 inmates. The road around the island was 13 miles. And there was actually 55 staff houses on the island that a number of staff lived on the island. And I lived on the island with my wife, Dee, and we had our daughter was just a little baby at the time. So it's very interesting place. Most of the staff had to ride a boat to work. So they'd catch a boat over on the mainland, which is in Silicon, Washington, catch the 7:10 boat, take them about 15, 20 minutes, get off 7:30, walk up and go to work. After work, they'd walk down, catch the 4:40 boat, and take it back to the mainland. So it's got a very unique facility. Actually, that book there, a friend of mine recently published that a couple years ago. So that was kind of cool. I got a copy of that, and the author actually used several photos that I provided her. So you can get a book on McNeil Island if you want. What I did at McNeil, I was in fire safety. I trained a 10-man inmate fire brigade. And we had responsibility for fire control for the whole island, for the 2 institutions, for the staff housing, for the boats, you name it. The inmates were trained just like any other volunteer firefighter in the nation. There's certain standards you have to meet to be a firefighter, and the inmates met those same standards. We really loved McNeil Island. It was really a beautiful place, but the feds decided to close the facility down. So in 1981, we turned it over to the state of Washington, and they still have a small facility on McNeil Island. At that time, when it closed, I was able to transfer back to the Federal Correctional Institution in Sandstone, Minnesota. Again, I had fire safety responsibilities. That's my fire truck. Or was my fire truck at Sandstone, trained at 5-man inmate fire brigade, and we actually would work with the local volunteer fire department, Sandstone. So we train with them, back them up if they needed our assistance for any fires of significance. The Bureau really doesn't do any firefighting anymore. The federal system, there's just a lot of liability there. A lot of training requirements. I do believe that some state facilities and maybe some county facilities still provide inmates to do help with forest fire fighting or grass fires or things like that. So I think there still are some inmate fire crews out there in the correctional system. That's just a shot of kind of a modern housing unit, that how they're kind of constructed nowadays. That's not what it's like out at FMC, but or at the Federal Medical Center. But these are kind of called pods. They're constructed like 2 levels, open cells around the unit, open areas for the inmates to play cards or watch TV. So again, sometimes the construction of a correctional institution will depend on the custody or the security level that it's going to be assigned. Okay, here we go. The Federal Medical Center. That's a picture of the administration building of the Federal Medical Center. That's the entrance to the administrative facility. And if anybody, if it's just like the airport, if you go in there to volunteer or tour or whatever, you got to go in there and take your belt off, take your shoes off, and maybe even a higher level of security than you're used to. So the Federal Medical Center, again, it's a unique mission as far as federal prisons. It has a medical surgical unit. It's a mental health referral center. There are 6 medical centers in the Bureau. Again, like 122 prisons, so they need a number of medical centers. But right now, the FMC count is 615. I mentioned that, but 200 are work cadre inmates. What that means is they're the inmates with no type of medical issues or mental health disabilities, and they do the maintenance and the work at the facility. So they'll mow the grass, they'll shovel the snow, they'll paint the walls, they'll help prepare food. So those are inmates doing regular time at Rochester. Over 400 staff out at the Federal Medical Center. There you see the FMC has a contract with the Mayo Clinic, and that's one of the reasons why the Bureau looked at placing a facility in Rochester when the state hospital became available, was it's a medical community. The Mayo Clinic was here. So they still average, I believe, around 5 to 8 medical trips, Monday through Friday, downtown to the Mayo Clinic for various reasons. Certainly, FMC has their own a number of physicians and nurses, and that they do have some diagnostic equipment, but there is some things that they just can't do and they need assistance on. Mayo Clinic will provide that to FMC. One of the things that's very important is when these guys come in the door, in particular, like for the work cadre units that are just doing time, you hope that individuals will come in, and if they're doing 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years, maybe they can walk out of there with something they didn't have when they walked in. So FMC has some apprenticeship programs in heating, ventilation, air conditioning, electrical, plumbing, paint, biomedical. So if an inmate's doing some time, he's going to be there for a while. If he gets in one of these programs, it's 6,000 to 8,000 hours. And if he completes it, he walks out of there with that type of apprenticeship training certificate, and maybe that will help that individual get a job. I think the Bureau has always tried to ensure that the inmates program somehow. So if they're not working, maybe they're in education, getting a GED, learning English. So we want to keep them busy, them in treatment, again, doing something constructive. The mental health unit at the Federal Medical Center, same thing. We try to have some work programming for them besides the mental health treatment they might be going through. So they have a recycling operation, a small printing plant, laundry, small equipment repair. Again, try to keep those guys busy, try to provide them with some skills. Other support systems at the Federal Medical Center are, they have 3 chaplains. They bring a lot of volunteer groups in to put on programs for the inmates. Drug treatment programming, reentry coordinator, and social workers at the Federal Medical Center. 5 counts a day. We got to keep track of the guys. So 5 times a day they are counted. 12:15 a.m., 3 a.m., 5 a.m. Now, when you count them, you can't just count a lump in the bed. You have to make sure you're counting an individual. So that's not always easy at 3 a.m., but you need to see skin, you need to see movement, you need to see breathing. You need to ensure that you're counting a body. So 5 times a day that is done, and we make sure we have every single individual. Okay, I like to refer to the security staff who work out there as correctional officers, not a guard. To me, a guard is the individual who maybe drives a truck around the Apache Mall, from midnight to 8. Our correctional officers out there in the federal prison, very similar to law enforcement, they're highly trained. So I like to see that terminology used. Inmates may view a correctional officer as a mentor, a counselor, an advisor, someone he or she can trust. The correctional officers will work in the dormitories. You may be there for a number of years. An inmate may be there for a number of years. You get to know each other. Of course, there's always that line, but still, if you treat that individual, if I treat that inmate with some dignity and some respect and honesty, hopefully he's going to treat me the same way. And after a period of time, he may come to me and say, hey, Mr. Else, what about this? What should I do about this? And if we can, we help him. We say, well, go see your counselor, or this is what you should do. So the relationships are important, that they're professional. And I always took that very serious in my career, that I treat all those guys out there with some dignity, greet them every day. How you doing? Inmates worked for me for many, many years. And I thought that was important, how we treat them. Tough job. Correctional workers, correctional officers, over 410,000. I hate that this even hurts me to say it, but COs have a high mortality rate and a high rate of suicide, divorce, and alcoholism. And certainly understaffing will continue to be a huge issue. You add the last couple of years with COVID, and I guess similar to law enforcement and corrections, it's been a very tough couple of years for the staff working at the Federal Correctional Institution, at the Homestead Detention Center, at any correctional facility across our country. It's not been easy. Okay. How in the world did Department of Justice get this prime real estate in Rochester? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. The closure of the Rochester State Hospital in 1981, the Minnesota legislature ordered the closing of the 104-year-old hospital by July 1st, 1982. It was crushing news to the community. The state hospital is deeply rooted in this community. They're going to lose close to 500 jobs. And those other couple bullets I just put up there to just understand the scope of the state hospital. In 1954, the facility had 1,800 patients. In 1963, there were 9,000 patients in state hospitals. And the Rochester State Hospital was the surgical facility of the state. And what I mean by that is a patient in Moose Lake or Fergus Falls or other state hospitals needed a medical treatment, surgical treatment, they'd be sent to Rochester. And the Mayo Clinic provided that service to the state hospital. They provided physicians and surgery and recovery at no cost. It was kind of an unbelievable deal. So I wanted to kind of understand this a little bit. So I found an individual by the name of Jeff Johnson, a friend of mine. And Jeff worked as a rehabilitation counselor, not necessarily for the state hospital, but for the state of Minnesota. And he was assigned to the state hospital. And Jeff would assess and assist the mentally disabled and chemically dependent for job training or job placement. And when I interviewed Jeff about the closing of the state hospital, I can tell you he was still, it still bothered him, you know, that the place closed, and it came down so fast. Just said his boss called him in and said, we could be shut down, and they're going to make that decision in the next couple, 3 months. And for Jeff, he just couldn't believe that a decision of that magnitude had to be made that quickly. Jeff was hired right out of college in 1976 after obtaining his master's degree. He got married in 1977, and he loved his job and he loved his life. He felt proud to work and serve in the community he grew up in, and Jeff grew up in Rochester. So why did they close the Rochester State Hospital? These were huge old facilities. Some of them built in the early 1900s, some had new buildings, maybe they're built in the 1950s, 1960s. But there was a question that these large old facilities, were they getting good care? Budget issues at the federal and state level. I think some legislation, even in the late 70s and early 80s, started from the federal side, started to push some of those mental health responsibilities to the state. New drugs were more effective. There was more outpatient therapy, was becoming more acceptable and less expensive. And the result was the patient numbers were really starting to drop. And I'll show you those figures in a little bit. But the red flag was flying a little bit. Even in the late 70s, the governor of Minnesota was talking about closing down some of the state hospitals. So back to Jeff. Jeff's boss, you know, loved Jeff. He wanted to keep Jeff working for him, and they were reassigned up to Minneapolis. Said, come on, Jeff, stay with me. We got a job up in Minneapolis. But Jeff, his home was in Rochester. He was going to have his wife was pregnant at the time, and it just didn't work. And that's the case for many people when they lose their job. It's hard to relocate if you're rooted in a community. And eventually, Jeff did find work in the business office of Mayo Clinic, and I believe Jeff has recently retired from the Mayo. So it worked out for him. But when everything came down, it was very stressful, and it's tough to lose your job. Was closing the Rochester State Hospital, was the beginning of closing the state hospitals a mistake? I sent a note to Senator Dave Sengen, and of course, a lot of this predated Dave. He wasn't in the legislature at that time, but he reflected maybe closing down of all of the facilities was a mistake. Certainly, we know how mental health has emerged as a huge problem. I think finding a bed for patients in Southeast Minnesota or throughout the country has continued to be difficult and continued to be a problem, because really all those state facilities started shutting down all over the country in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And of course, the Rochester State Hospital, in a sense, some people said it was the flagship of the Minnesota State Hospital. So the closing of it was a shock. They couldn't believe it. They had the Mayo connection, but and a lot of people felt the decision was political, and I think people who were here at that time, that was a huge belief. So there's been difficulties in finding mental health beds. I mentioned that, but some of you may be aware that a new facility just opened up. In fact, Senator Stringham cut the ribbon for it a few weeks ago. The Southeast Regional Crisis Center is a new 24/7 walk-in mental health facility designed for people experiencing a mental health crisis. So that was recently opened. It's 16 beds. And Senator Stringham said that there's already funds for some additional regional crisis centers to be built in Minnesota. So that's a good thing, that more beds will become available. So as the hospital shut down and was vacated and everything auctioned and it was emptied, and what was going to happen to it? What was going to happen to it? And I know that the governor at the time, I think he named a 15-person committee to look at different options for the state hospital grounds and buildings. And I think they came out with a few different options. In fact, one of them was a women's prison. A lot went on in regards to this, and the state eventually sold the state hospital and all the buildings and all the grounds to Olmsted County for $1. For $1. Well, then, again, the Bureau of Prisons, the federal system, when they look for places for new institutions, it may vary. They may look at an existing facility they feel they can renovate, or they may just build from ground zero. It just varies. But when they saw this potential in the medical community, they decided to make a go at it. And they ended up dealing with Olmsted County because they now own the property. And the feds paid them $14 million for 6 buildings and part of the grounds. And people were not happy. So part of it was prison not in my backyard. You hear that from all kinds of stuff, pipelines or whatever. We don't want to be known as a prison town, and we can understand. We can understand people not wanting a prison in their backyard. But there was even some, people were still upset over the closing of the state hospital. But now there's going to be more security. There's going to be fences. There's going to be razor wire. Property values are going to drop. There is a lot of concern in the community. And really, overall, the community was against it. So the Bureau had a lot of PR work to do after they did buy the property for $14 million. So Dr. Joe Bogan was the first warden for the Federal Medical Center. Upon his arrival, he immediately got involved with the community, joined the Rotary, the Chamber. His mission was to connect with the people of the community, the leaders of the community, and talk about what that mission was going to be, what to expect from the Federal Medical Center. And I talked to Dr. Bogan about this. He's retired in the state of Oklahoma. So he talked about, it was important to him, he allowed any group that wanted to come out and tour, he would allow them to come in. Granted all press release or requests, he would talk to any reporters. So he really opened the place up, and as it started to be built, and tried to really bring the community, just let them know what was going to happen out of the Federal Medical Center. And I think he did a great job. The dedication was in September 1985. Was anybody here at the dedication? So the Federal Medical Center got underway. Now let's kind of step back and talk a little bit about the Rochester State Hospital. That's a look at the state hospital in 1895. I mean, look at the scope of that place. It's just gigantic. It opened January 1st, 1879, and officially became the Rochester State Hospital in 1893. It had some other names before that, like Second Hospital for the Insane for the state, some things. So it officially became Rochester State Hospital in 1893. I talked about some patient numbers, and here I'll show you. So in 1879, when it opened, they had 14 staff, and I think that first year they got up to 100 patients. A number of them came from St. Peter. 1930, 243 staff, 1,400 patients. So you can see the scope of it was getting huge. Now go to 1979, you got a lot more staff and patients, and you can imagine that was kind of a red flag as those patient numbers dropped. So they had 567 staff and 444 patients. One of the things that a lot of people who've lived in this area all their life, they know a lot of history about the state hospital. And one of the always interesting things was a monstrous farm that they had. And this is just a snapshot of 1917 of the farm out at the state hospital. They had 14 hired men, 60 patients were assisting in the farm operation, 1,700 acres, 900 acres cultivated, 115 acres of potatoes. I mean, look at all 4,000 tomato plants. So I imagine tomatoes were on the menu quite a bit in the kitchen, but it was a huge operation. It was kind of a model in the early 1900s that patients get outside, that they work, they get sunlight. All that was really what they felt was good for them. That type of work and stuff. I don't know if the patients thought that, but the farm did close down, I believe, in the 1960s. And again, some of you that know the history, a number of acres were sold, which is now Quarry Hill, was part of the Rochester State Hospital grounds. So again, a huge operation. They had their own dairy, kitchen, bakery, all kinds of shops, their own water supply powerhouse. They did have some staff residents that had been built on the site, all different units. So it was a huge, huge operation. Self-contained, self-sufficient facility. I remember seeing another report of how many chickens and how many eggs they I can't remember, but it was a lot of eggs. And certainly early on in the 1900s, we talked about getting outside and working in sunlight, but little was offered to the patients besides care, custody, recreation, and work. And it was in later years that then more treatment started to come in a more formal basis. These are a little hard to see, but I just wanted to I just listed a bunch of bullet items of how rooted into the community that the Rochester State Hospital was. I mean, in some of the research I did, numerous organizations, the Legion, the auxiliaries, the Kiwanis, all kinds of people helped the state hospital. They would volunteer, they would bring gifts in for Christmas, they bring food in for Thanksgiving, they put on dances and Valentine's Day. People were really trying to assist and help the patients out there. So here you see 1924, a doubleheader baseball game was on the grounds. Stuff like that the patients loved. Go watch some baseball. Christmas party for World War I veterans. I do remember seeing, I think, a couple years after World War I, the state hospital received over 100 veterans from the war. So, and we can imagine that what some of those issues were I thought this was interesting. Dr. Kilbourne was the superintendent for 45 years, and when he died in 1934, Dr. W.J. and Dr. C.H. Mayo were his pallbearers. So again, they were even tied into Mayo Clinic, tied into the community. July 1940, the nursing school closed. They had a nursing school out there for 50 years. Social work conference. I mean, it was just like the Mayo Clinic back then. They would have conferences at the state hospital. They had a drum and bugle corps, and they did march in some parades. Now, I'm not sure. I think it might have been a combination of staff and patients. I couldn't quite tell for sure. But again, a lot was going on. 1962, they're accredited by Joint Commission, just like any healthcare organization. They went through the community standards. They were evaluated to community standards and were accredited. Winona University used the state hospital for some of their nursing classes. And a little bit in regards to the closure, 1967, Governor Levander, even at that time, they were looking at closing some of the state hospitals in Minnesota. So the numbers were even dropping then in the late 60s. And an interesting aside is the bill that closed the Rochester State Hospital opened the Oak Park Heights Correctional Facility, which is a maximum security, or was at one time. I'm not sure what it is now, but a major prison in Minnesota around Stillwater. There was a referendum that people voted on against the federal prison. The votes was 3-1 against, but you know, it didn't hold a lot of weight. In January 1983, Olmsted County bought it for $1. May 1984, the BOP paid $14 million. That's a pretty good investment. $1. Actually, I did read somewhere, and I wasn't aware of this, that they did. The county did have to split some of that money with the state, so they didn't get it all. And this was interesting too. This was headlines in the Rochester Post Bulletin. 1,000 people showed up looking for work when the Federal Medical Center said, we're going to hire 300 or 400 people. A whole bunch of people came out looking for work. So the state hospital, like the Federal Medical Center, had medical units, medical surgical units. Certainly some patients had medical issues as well as mental health, psychiatric units, psychology services, chemical dependency unit. This is all in the state hospital, and units for the severely mentally ill. So this just basically says that additional resources continue to be needed for our mental health issues across the state, whether it be beds. We've heard this, that individuals with mental health problems may end up in prison because of criminal behavior. And one thing I'll say about that, I'm talking to an individual that I know, said that that's not always a bad thing. And what I mean by that is, say individual goes to Rochester and he's supervised. They make sure he takes his medication, he eats properly. So sometimes correctional facilities, if they're in there, they can provide some care for them as well. That's kind of what I'm getting at. So I guess you could say there's a connection here from the state hospital to the Federal Medical Center. For the past 142 years, on the same grounds, mental health patients are being treated and cared for. And I can tell you from working out at the Federal Medical Center for the last 15 years of my career, people cared for those individuals. It was important to all of us to do our best to help them in their time in Rochester. Questions? That's no fire truck at McNeil Island, by the way. And now it'd be if you get off the boat at McNeil Island, you have to walk all the way up there to the administration building and go to work. So you got in your steps. They didn't have Fitbits back then. So. All right, I'll take some questions.
You
Was
mentioned,
there any of the buildings from the state hospital are still present?
From the original state hospital? Well, I think those buildings that are there now were built in the late 50s, you know, building 9, building 10. So they've gone through about 3 waves of buildings. So some of them were used. The tunnel system was part of the state hospital. And they actually had built the chapel shortly before it closed. So the chapel that's at the Federal Medical Center looks fairly modern, but it was utilized by the state hospital before the feds took it over. And again, the feds only bought so many buildings. I think it was 6 buildings and just part of the grounds. So they certainly didn't buy the entire campus.
you were talking about federal prisons versus prison camps, and it seemed like there were several different terms you were using. Can you distinguish for the audience what those were?
Well,
There's a difference.
I guess a federal prison camp would normally be a minimum security prison, which would mean there would be no fences, no walls. So the inmates, the residents that are in there are nonviolent, maybe doing, you know, short time, whatever that is, could be 10 months or 2 years for a white collar crime, mail fraud, income tax. So the camps are normally, you know, not a very high population, but again, very staffing is lower, no perimeter fence. Or once you move to the next security level, then you start getting the fences, perimeter walls, things like that. And each security level is more, there's more security built into the prison, put it that way. Does that help?
We did have a question come in from Zoom. Did any of the patients from the state hospital end up in the Federal Medical Center?
I do not know that. Couple did. Dr. Norton is here today. I worked with Dr. Norton out at the Federal Medical Center. So a couple that you know of, he came to the Federal Medical Center.
One of the things the federal prison system tried to do was keep inmates close to where they were from. So there were a couple patients at the state hospital that were from Rochester. When the state hospital closed, they unfortunately committed crimes and then ended up at FMC.
So there was a couple. And again, the Bureau would try to do that if possible that would help with families if, you know, if the guy's from St. Paul, if he could do time with Duluth or Rochester, that was better for his family. It depended too on the count, was the room for him to be assigned there, all different kinds of things, or his security level. But that was a great thing to do, to have the family be able to visit them. And even, you know, when you think about that, when the state hospital was closed, not only did it affect staff, it affected the patients, it affected the patient families, where they started having to move some of the patients or residents to areas that their families maybe couldn't visit them like they had before.
How many escapes have there been from the Federal Medical Center?
How many escapes from the Federal Medical Center? It opened in 1984. There has been one, but that was not from within the facility. That was an inmate who had community custody, who was working outside the perimeter, outside the fence, and because he had the custody to do that, and he took off. So we've had one escape, and we kind of classify that as a walk away. When they're outside the perimeter of the institution, like at Duluth, they just walk away. They're a walk away. But if I remember right, somebody picked him up, I think, and I think they did eventually find him, but it might have took a couple of years or something. But I do remember that we had a public open house after that, and people were not happy. I was at that meeting with the warden, and there was some, we got chewed out a little bit by the community. So, but again, so just one, and that was a low security inmate.
So did the Rochester State Hospital buildings that were not bought out torn down?
I believe they probably are all torn down now. There was some outside the perimeter, but I think they've all been replaced. But for quite a few years, there was still some buildings of the port building, which was out front, and there was a couple other buildings that the Bureau didn't buy. To my knowledge, all those buildings outside of the Fed spot are no longer standing. But I could be wrong.
Is there any connection between the Federal Medical Center and the Olmsted Medical Center?
Not that I know of. But our contracts with Mayo, again, I'm not positive on that, if they've used OMC for anything in particular, but from my recollection, our contract's always been with Mayo.
And is it the same contract that the state hospital had?
No, because we have to pay. Again, like I believe I mentioned, for a number of years, Mayo Clinic provided medical surgical treatment for state hospital patients at no charge. But of course, every one of our trips down to Mayo Clinic with inmates, we are billed for.
Okay.
Are the federal medical centers co-ed?
Not right now. We've had some. They've had some female residents over the years, but just like one or two here and there. But Waseca is all female, so they will go to Waseca if they're in the area. It's possible that if it's a specialized medical case, or possibly even mental health evaluation, they could come to Rochester briefly, but to my knowledge, there is no females inmates or residents there at this time.
Who are some notable inmates that have been held at FMC?
Notable inmates. Jim Baker, the preacher. Lyndon LaRoche, presidential candidate. We had the one sheik who was part of the World Trade Center bombing. So that was not 9/11. I'm talking prior to that. I think there's been a couple of congressmen. I think there's been a couple of professional athletes. One was a hockey player. I think one was. But a few notables, and most individuals they just try to do their time. You know, if they get assigned or whatever, a politician, they just try to do their year or 2 years and keep a low profile and get out of there. So,
Have you heard any intriguing stories about the buildings or tunnels of the FMC being haunted?
I have not. We certainly utilize the tunnel system a lot. The prison would utilize the tunnel system during adverse weather, during tornado warnings. It's 40 below, they use the tunnel. So our tunnels are well lit. There's security down there. They're sectioned off. So no haunted tunnels that I know of.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about Wasika and where women go for medical treatment, if not to FMC?
Well, there is 6 medical centers across the Bureau. I think there's one in Lexington, Carswell, Lexington, Kentucky. Devon's is, I have no idea. There is a number of 6 total medical centers. I'm not sure the medical facilities nearby some of those other medical centers, but my guess is maybe 1 or 2 of them may specialize a little bit more in the females. I remember I was to Lexington one time and they did have females there. But I can assure you that they will receive the same medical care that the male inmates do. I don't think that answered the question, but there's more options, put it that way, than just Rochester. So there's 5 other medical centers out there for the Bureau that might be able to handle female patients instead of Rochester.
So we had a comment, Dennis Hastert, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Reps, was at FMC about 4 years ago.
All right. Yep.
And is there a specific ratio of chaplains to inmates?
I don't know if there's a ratio there. They do have 3 chaplains out there. A lot of the chaplains also employ a lot of volunteers. And of course, that's probably been cut back over COVID and stuff, but they normally have outside groups coming in all the time for music or workshops or all kinds of different things. But I think, you know, the higher your count, the more chaplains you're going to have. And you know, Rochester County is not that high as compared to Leavenworth or in Atlanta, but they do have 3 chaplains. And the other thing they do in regards to the religious services is they'll bring in contract chaplains or contract people for different faiths. So they'll make sure that all the different faiths are covered with appropriate people coming in, whether it be Muslim, Native American, you name it. They try to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to worship.
Are there inmates that serve their entire sentence in a federal medical center? I know you talked about the word cadre.
I would say that's possible, yeah. So an individual could be assigned there initially. And if they get into one of those apprenticeship programs, then sometimes they'll leave them there. So maybe if they're trying to complete a 6,000-hour apprenticeship program in electrical work, and that's going to take them 5 or 6 years, they'll leave them there and let them finish that. And then if they've only got a year or 2 left, they might just stay there. So that does happen. And not as much at Rochester because our work cadre inmates are not, we don't have that many, 200 to 300, I guess. So where other facilities might have 700, 800, 1,000 inmates. So the potential for a guy doing his time at one facility is higher. But again, a lot of things depend on security level and custody as well. So they might move them out if they're getting closer to the end of their sentence.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you did specifically at the Federal Medical Center and how it would be different doing that at a medical center versus the prisons that you were at before?
Well, what I did, I was in environmental health and safety and fire protection. So I talked about inmates doing our work. Our inmates are treated just like employees in a sense. We have to make sure that they're trained, that they're safe, that we meet all OSHA guidelines for safety. We have to ensure that the facility meets all fire codes. So if there's a fire at 3 o'clock in the morning, we know what to do. We know that we can evacuate them, get them out. We must meet environmental regulations. We're like any business, so I oversaw a lot of that. The Federal Medical Center had a little bit more of a joint commission, medical mission, accreditation piece than maybe another prison that was, they would have a couple large industries, a printing plant or a glove factory or a furniture factory. Rochester didn't really have that. So the safety individual at each facility, it just depended on what operations they had that might have more responsibilities in industrial safety, where I had more responsibilities in healthcare safety, if that makes sense.
That's it for questions on Zoom. Are there any questions from the audience?
Yes.
I was just wondering about that McNeil. So if they close that down, is it McNeil Island?
Yes.
What is it? Can you tour? Can you do a tour?
Well, the state, the question was about McNeil Island. I said we turned it over to the state in 1981. The state at that time was desperate for prison space. So they ended up building some new buildings, completely took it over and operated it full bore for a number of years. Recently, they shut down most of the prisons on McNeil. They do have one specialized unit, deals with sexual crimes and predators and things like that. So they do have one small unit still on McNeil. McNeil is a beautiful island. I think that the state of Washington hopes that at some point all corrections will be gone from there and they can kind of reclaim that island because it's absolutely gorgeous. But right now there still is a prison on the island, so people really are not allowed to go on the island unless there's approved. And I'm sure you wouldn't be approved. Oh, sorry. I know.
Another question come in. Do they have lockdowns for security reasons at FMC?
Yes. Reasons might vary, but there could be outside reasons, it could be inside reasons. Certainly during COVID, there was much more lockdowns. So instead of the units going to the kitchen for meals, the food was brought to them. So I think in a way during the past couple of years, there's been a much more of a lockdown in the overall operation. I haven't been out there, I don't know for sure, but certainly they try to minimize contact, minimize movement. But a lot of facilities will, maybe there is an assault, maybe there is a stabbing, maybe, and they might shut down, lock down until they figure out is this going to involve more inmates? Is this a bigger thing than what we see now? So facilities are locked down.
You mentioned after 9/11 security, that's right.
Yeah, Dr. Norton said after 9/11, we pretty much, the facility locked down because we did have a known terrorist connected to them. So we increased our security, we had more perimeter patrols, we beefed up security throughout the facility. Really for a year or two, we were on high alert, at least for a year, you'd think, Steve. We were on high alert after 9/11. So everybody was working overtime, everybody was doing a lot of more security related duties, all of us, until that kind of settled down. But it was initially locked down until we could figure out what our next step would be and how should we proceed to make sure everyone's safe. Inmates are safe, staff are safe.
So do FMCs seem less prison-like than a traditional federal correctional facility?
Less prison-like. I guess it's less prison-like than Leavenworth or Atlanta or some old penitentiaries. I think the Federal Medical Center is unique. If you walk into the buildings are around, it's kind of a campus type setting in the middle of summer. It looks really nice. But once you get into the buildings, you see, what's going on. But I would say, yeah, maybe a little. Again, but then you take Duluth, there's no fences at all. And Duluth was from an old air base, so they had a lot of the dormitories there. So it just varies. They all have their own unique characteristics, but FMC can look pretty nice in July.
Are there any other questions from the audience?
What about the drug crimes? 46% of them are drug crimes.
Questions, 46% are drug crimes, and that's all drug trafficking, what they call it. So people that manufacture drugs, people that distribute the drugs, people that sell the drugs. So all that is, that whole percentage comes from that circle of drug use. You've got, different, you got the meth, you've got cocaine, you've got crack powder. So the drug war has never worked very well, put it that way, our war on drugs.
Are weapons that inmates make an issue?
They can be, yeah. Certainly, even at Rochester, we found weapons. In particular, what a homemade knife may be made in one of the shops. So they can be. That's always a concern. The facility does constant shakedowns. We'll shake down a cell. We have metal detectors when guys go to work. So we try to stay on top of it, but those guys there's always, unfortunately, going to be some weapons out there. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
So I do want to say thank you so much to our audience tonight for asking so many great questions, and also to our presenter for sharing his time and expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from Rochester stories to Civil War battlefield photography and so much more. Be sure to check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
So how about